You think you're who? You're just a farmer, Caleb. A relic in a world that's moving toward curb appeal and property values." End quote. Karen Whitmore's voice didn't endopos. T just vibrate in that sterile HOA office. It sliced through the air like a cold blade, her face contorting into this mask of suburban rage as I pushed that unsigned, end quote, water cooperation agreement, end quote, back across her mahogany desk. And in that moment, looking at her perfectly manicured nails and her cream-colored blazer, I realized she had no idea what I'd found buried beneath the soil of my eastern field. She had no idea that her precious, end quote, crown jewel, end quote, fountain was about to become the stinking monument to her own professional suicide. And as I stood there, smelling the faint, lingering scent of my grandfather's tobacco on my own jacket, I knew that the 3 generations of dirt under my fingernails held more power than every legal threat she could scream at me. It started on a Tuesday morning, about 6:30 a.m., when the autumn air was so biting cold it felt like needles against my skin, and my coffee was the only thing keeping my hands from freezing shut. I'd walked out to the eastern edge of the property to check the irrigation pressure because the corn was looking thirsty, stressed in a way it shouldn't, and opos. TB during a wet month, and I expected to find a clogged filter or maybe a failing pump in the lake, but what I found instead stopped me dead in my tracks, a scar across the land. A trench, maybe 2 weeks old based on how the dirt had settled and the weeds were trying to reclaim the edges, cutting straight across my property line from the direction of the Meadowbrook Heights gated community. I set my coffee down on a stump, my heart starting a slow, heavy thud against my ribs, and I knelt in the cold soil, brushing away the loose earth with my bare hands until my fingers hit something hard and synthetic. A 4-inch PVC pipe, buried 18 inches deep, running like a parasite through land that has belonged to the Thorntons since 1952. And I didn't endopos. TL. I didn't endopos. T-curse. I just felt this strange, icy calm settle over me as I followed that trench for nearly 200 feet. Past the old oak tree where my grandfather used to push me on a tire swing, past the rows of corn that were dying because someone was siphoning their lifeblood, all the way down to my private lake, where a submersible pump sat half-hidden in the reeds, humming away like a thief in the night. I pulled out my phone, documenting every single inch, embedding the GPS coordinates into every photo, making sure the timestamps were clear because I knew, even then, that this wasn't endopos, an accident or a surveyor's mistake. This was engineered theft, executed while I slept under the roof my father built. And for 18 months, Meadowbrook Heights had been sending me these petty, nagging letters, 23 of them in total, complaining about the, end quote, aesthetic impact, end quote, of my tractors, or the, end quote, olfactory nuisance, end quote, of my livestock, and I'd laugh them off as the ramblings of bored retirees. But looking at that pipe, I realized those letters were just a distraction, a way to see if I was paying attention while they literally tunneled under my feet. I walked to the very edge where my property hits their common area, and there it was, the smoking gun, a bright yellow sign staked into the ground, end quote, Landscape Improvement Project, approved by Board Resolution 2024-2007. Contractor, Precision Landscape LLC, end quote, and at the bottom, signed in that bold, arrogant blue ink that I would come to loathe, was the name, Karen Whitmore, HOA President. They hadn't endopos. T even bothered to ask. They hadn't endopos. T offered a dime for an easement. They just voted in a closed-door meeting to take what was mine because they decided their, end quote, entrance garden, end quote, was more important than my livelihood. And as I stood there in the mud, staring at that sign, I remembered something. My grandfather told me right before he passed. He'd look out at that lake as the sunset turned the water into liquid gold and say, end quote, Caleb, this land feeds us, and anyone who tries to take from it without asking. You teach them a lesson with exactly what they tried to steal, end quote. I spent the rest of that night buried in county records, the glow of my laptop the only light in the farmhouse, searching for any legal loophole, any forgotten utility right-of-way that could justify what they'd done, but there was nothing. No filing, no permit, no easement, just a black hole where the law should have been. And then I searched the contractor, Precision Landscape LLC, and found a business address that was just a residential house in a neighboring county. And that's when the first piece of the puzzle fell into place. There were no municipal water bills for a fountain that size, because Karen knew that a utility bill would show up on an audit. But stolen water? Stolen water is invisible. It's a ghost on a balance sheet. And it was the only way she could fund her, legacy project, while someone, somewhere, was pocketing the difference. When I finally walked into the HOA office the next morning, smelling like the barn and looking like the simple farmer, Karen wanted me to be, she kept me waiting for 45 minutes, probably thinking the wait would intimidate me. But I just sat there in that small, uncomfortable chair, looking at her framed certificates for, community leadership, aesthetic excellence, And when she finally let me in, she had this smile that never reached her eyes, a practiced, plastic expression that belonged on a mannequin, Mr. Thornton, she said, not even offering a hand, I understand you have concerns about our beautification initiative, but you have to understand that administrative boundaries are secondary to the collective good of our 247 homeowners, I didn't endopos. Sit down. I just held up my phone with the photo of the trench cutting through my corn, and I said, you ran a pipe through my land, and you're siphoning 2,400 gallons a day from my lake. I want it gone by Friday, And she just laughed, a high, sharp sound that made my skin crawl. And she told me that her board had legal resources I couldn't endopos. Imagine that they could tie me up in court for a decade. And then she leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper. That was pure venom, telling me she'd already received, sanitary complaints, about my farm, and that if I pushed her, she'd have the county health department crawling up my tail until I was forced to sell just to pay the fines. She thought she was holding all the cards. She thought she'd found my breaking point. But she didn't endopos. No, I'd already been to the diner 15 miles out of town to meet a man named Harold Jennings. A man who used to sit on her board and knew exactly whose brother-in-law owned Precision Landscape, LLC. The drive back from that HOA office was the longest 3 miles of my life, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard the leather groaned, and all I could hear was Karen's voice, that smug, I'm untouchable, lilt, echoing in my ears as I looked out at the corn stalks that were starting to curl at the edges, a sickly yellow tint creeping up from the roots like a fever, and I realized this wasn't endopos. Just about a pipe anymore. It was about a woman who thought she could treat my family's history like a cheap utility she didn't endopos have to pay for. And as I pulled into the farm, I saw the fertilizer tank sitting by the pump house, a 30,000-gallon steel beast filled with a nitrogen-rich, sulfur-heavy liquid nutrient that carries a scent so potent it can make a grown man's eyes water from 50 yards away. And the plan didn't endopos. Just come to me. It felt like it was whispered by the land itself. But before I moved a single valve, I needed to be sure, because my grandfather didn't endopos. Raised me to be a vigilante. He raised me to be a businessman who happens to wear boots. So I spent the next week moving with a clinical, quiet precision that would have made a sniper proud. I started with a surveyor named Mitchell, a guy who's been marking lines in this county since the Ford administration, and I paid him $400 for an expedited assessment. We walked that boundary line together. In the gray morning light, him shaking his head as he looked at the trench, Caleb, this is textbook trespass, he said, his voice low as he hammered a fresh stake into the dirt right next to their illegal pipe, No easement, no consent. They might as well have built a garage on your front porch. You have every right to rip this out of the ground right now, I thanked him for the certified report, tucked it into a growing manila folder, and then I went to see Harold Jennings at that dusty diner on the edge of the county. Harold looked like a man who had finally put down a heavy weight, his hands trembling slightly as he pushed a second folder across the table toward me. Internal HOA financial statements that should have never seen the light of day, and he told me the real story, the one Karen didn't endopos. T1 in the minutes. He told me that the fountain budget, was $47,000, but the equipment she'd installed was a $12,000 kit at best, and the rest? The rest was listed as project management fees, paid directly to Precision Landscape, LLC, a company registered to Ronald Whitmore, Karen's brother-in-law, who had conveniently incorporated the business just 60 days before the project started, She's using your water because she can't hide the municipal bills from the treasurer, Caleb, end quote. Harold whispered, his eyes darting to the door like he expected Karen to come charging in with a clipboard, end quote. She needs your lake to keep the fraud invisible. If the water isn't oppos, free, and oppos, she can keep the oppos, management fees and oppos, flowing into her family's pockets. And she's staking her whole re-election on that dedication ceremony. She wants to be the queen who brought beauty to the neighborhood, and she's using your farm to buy her crown, end quote. I sat there, stirring my cold coffee, and the humor of it finally hit me. A dark, jagged kind of humor, because Karen was so obsessed with the, end quote, crown jewel, end quote, of her entrance garden that she'd forgotten the most basic rule of the country. Don and oppos. To ever hook your dreams into another man and oppos' infrastructure without asking, because you never know what he's got running through those lines. By the time I got home, I had the FOIA response from the county building department waiting in my mailbox, and it was the final nail. No building permit, no application, no inspections. Legally, that fountain didn't and oppos exist. It was a ghost project built on stolen land with stolen water and laundered money. And then Karen's response to my, end quote, cease and desist, end quote, arrived, but it wasn't oppos. A surrender. It was a 10-page declaration of war from an aggressive law firm, accusing me of, and quote, intentional infliction of emotional distress, end quote, and, end quote, attempted extortion, end quote, threatening to bankrupt me if I even touched that pipe. I read it twice, leaning against the fender of my tractor, and I just smiled. Because Karen was doubling down. She was committing herself so deeply to a lie that she'd left herself no exit ramp. She'd gambled everything on the idea that I was just a, end quote, simple farmer, end quote, who would be scared of a few fancy words on a legal letterhead. The week before the ceremony, I went down to the pump house. It's a concrete bunker my grandfather built in the 80s, housing the distribution valves that feed 900 acres of Thornton land. And right there, less than 50 feet from where Karen's illegal pipe tapped into my lake line, was the fertilizer injection port, and my attorney, Douglas Werner, had been very clear. As the landowner, I have total authority over any infrastructure on my property that lacks a legal easement. I could disconnect it, I could cap it, or I could allow it to operate as part of my, end quote, legitimate agricultural operations, end quote. I didn't, end oppos, have to sabotage her pipe. I just had to treat it like it was part of my farm. I spent the evening making my adjustments with the same methodical care I used to calibrate a $1 million irrigation system. I closed the main lake valve to the HOA line, a simple quarter turn that cut off the, end quote, free, end quote, water she loved so much. And then I opened the secondary bypass, the one connected to the holding tank. And suddenly, Karen's, end quote, crown jewel, end quote, wasn't oppos drawing from the clear, blue depths of the lake anymore. It was primed and ready with 3,000 gallons of pure, liquid agricultural nutrients, a concentrated cocktail of nitrogen and sulfur that smells like a mix of rotting eggs and a 1,000-year-old stable. And I checked the pressure, verified the flow rate, and walked back to the house under a sky full of stars, feeling a strange kind of peace. I sent out 247 letters that Thursday, one to every resident in Meadowbrook Heights, not mention the fertilizer, but giving them the, end quote, heads up, end quote, that their fountain was built on stolen land and that, as a farmer, I would be exercising my legal rights to manage the infrastructure on my property starting Saturday morning. My phone started ringing almost immediately. Angry residents, confused neighbors, and eventually, a screaming call from Karen herself at 9 p.m. On the night before her big day. She told me she'd have me in handcuffs if I interfered with the ceremony. She told me I wasn't, quote, small-minded, end quote, and, end quote, vindictive, end quote, and I just listened to her breathe for a second before I said, end quote, Mrs. Whitmore, I'm not interfering with anything. Your ceremony will go exactly as you've planned, and your fountain will spray exactly what my farm provides. I suggest you wear something you don and oppos. Mind getting a little and oppos. Earthy and oppos. End quote. The morning of the dedication ceremony arrived with a sky so blue it looked painted, the kind of perfect, crisp Saturday that real estate agents dream about. And I stood at my kitchen window, watching the motorcade of luxury SUVs line up at the Meadowbrook Heights entrance like a funeral procession for a queen who didn't end oppos. T know she was already dead. I'd arrived at the edge of the subdivision around 10:45 a.m., parking my beat-up Ford on the public shoulder, just far enough to be a spectator, but close enough to smell the anticipation, and eventually, the consequences. The end quote. Crown jewel end quote. Plaza was packed. I'm talking over 200 residents in their weekend best, khaki shorts and sundresses, a small stage draped in blue and white bunting, and right at the center of it all stood Karen Whitmore. She was wearing a cream-colored dress that probably cost more than my first tractor, beaming at the crowd like she'd just discovered fire, and beside her was a reporter from the local Gazette, camera poised to capture the end quote, historic end quote, moment when the Thornton family lake became the backdrop for her social ascension. Karen took the podium at 11:15 a.m., her voice amplified by a sound system that echoed off the stone pillars of the entrance, and she started in on this speech about end quote, vision, end quote, about end quote, community pride, end quote, and how this fountain was a testament to end quote, leadership that refuses to settle for anything less than excellence, end quote. She didn't end oppose. T mentioned the $34,000 in crop damage her theft had caused me. She didn't end oppose. T mentioned the $32,000 in, end quote, management fees, end quote, she'd funneled to her brother-in-law. She just stood there, a predator in silk, basking in the applause of a crowd she was actively robbing. I stood at the back, the manila folder tucked under my arm like a silent witness, and I thought about my grandfather's voice, the way he used to say that the land always gets its due, one way or another. End quote. And now, end quote, Karen shouted, her voice reaching a fever pitch as she gestured toward the dry, stone basin behind her, end quote. Without further delay, I present to you the soul of Meadowbrook Heights, end quote. She pressed a small remote control with a flourish that was pure theater, and for a split second, there was only the faint, deep hum of the pumps kicking in beneath the plaza, and then, the end quote, crown jewel end quote, erupted. The liquid that shot 15 feet into the air was Nandapos, the sparkling, crystal-clear water of the Thornton Lake. It was a thick, brownish-green sludge that looked like it had been dredged from the bowels of a swamp, and it didn't Nandapos. Just fall. It clung. But the smell? Oh God, the smell hit the crowd like a physical wall, a concentrated, atmospheric punch of ammonia and sulfur that was so thick you could practically taste it. It was the unmistakable, eye-watering stench of 3,000 gallons of industrial-strength fertilizer being atomized in the midday sun. The screams started almost instantly. People were gagging, clutching their throats, scrambling backwards so fast they were knocking over folding chairs and tramping through the manicured hedges they'd spent so much money on. But Karen was right in the splash zone. She stood there like a statue of salt as the dark, stinking rain soaked into her cream-colored dress, turning it a muddy, mottled brown, her hair plastered to her face, her expensive makeup running in dark streaks like she was melting. Her end quote, crown jewel end quote, was raining agricultural reality down on her head, and the local reporter was catching every single second of the catastrophe on high-definition video. End quote, turn it off. Someone turn it off. End quote, Karen shrieked, but her voice was raw from the ammonia, and it took the panicked maintenance guy nearly a minute to find the override. When the fountain finally sputtered and died, the silence that followed was heavier than the smell. A 200-person crowd stood in the ruins of their end quote, prestige, end quote, staring at a president who was literally dripping with the very thing she tried to use as a threat against me. And that's when I stepped forward, walking calmly through the chaos until I was standing right at the edge of the stage. End quote, Mrs. Whitmore, end quote, I said, my voice carrying through the quiet with a clarity that made everyone turn, end quote. I think your residents deserve to know why their fountain is drawing from my agricultural fertilizer system instead of the lake you didn't Nandapos. Do you have a permit to tap into? End quote. I held up the folder, pulling out the FOIA response and the business registry for Precision Landscape LLC. And I didn't Nandapos. TL. I just read the facts. I told them about the lack of easements, the stolen water, the $65,000 of their money that had been laundered through her brother-in-law's shell company. And as I spoke, I watched the faces of the homeowners shift from shock to a cold, jagged fury. The aftermath was a landslide. Karen resigned the next morning, but it didn't Nandapos. Save her, She was charged with 3 counts of embezzlement and criminal trespass, and her brother-in-law's company was dissolved by the state licensing board before the month was out. She ended up with 2 years of probation and a court order to pay $85,000 in restitution, covering every cent she stole from the HOA and every penny of the crop damage she caused my farm. And the video of her fertilizer baptism went so viral it was featured on national news, becoming the ultimate cautionary tale for every HOA board that thinks they're above the law. The pipe was ripped out of my land 47 days later by a county crew, and as I watched them fill in the trench, I felt the pressure in my irrigation lines return to a steady, powerful hum. The corn began to recover, the lake stayed still and private, and for the first time in years, the Thornton smell that Karen hated so much actually felt like the scent of justice. I still sit on my porch every evening, watching the sun turn the water to gold, and I think about how some people try to build their empires on stolen ground, forgetting that the people who work the soil are the ones who truly know where the power is buried. So, let's settle this in the comments. Was Project Fertilizer a justified exercise of property rights, or did I take the lesson a step too far? Have you ever dealt with an HOA president who treated the neighborhood like their own personal piggy bank? Because remember, documentation is your shield, but sometimes a little nitrogen is the best way to make the truth grow. Would you like me to go into more detail about the specific criminal proceedings against Karen and Ronald, or perhaps tell you the story of how the new HOA board and I finally reached a legal water sharing agreement that actually benefited the farm?